Great. Sorry, I was mute then, wasn't I? Which is like a total rookie error. I should be used to this by now. So if you were around 2 weeks ago, you'll know that what we've been doing is we're trying to think a little bit about God's heart for the poor. So that's our focus for the next few weeks, is to try and think a little bit about God's heart for the poor. And what we thought we'd do is we do it in a way that means that we sort of do a bit of a sweep through the biblical story. And so we started last time with the creation story. And the thing we thought a little bit about was what it means to be a steward, not an owner. So what does it mean to say that actually, God, all this stuff belongs to you, and I'm just kind of looking after it for you. I'm just looking after it in trust for you. So we kind of thought a little bit about that. And there was loads of homework 2 weeks ago. So apologies for all the homework. But hopefully you might have had a chance to have a little bit about some of those questions of what it means to be a steward rather than an owner. So what we're going to do today is we're going to carry on with the story. So we're going to kind of keep going with the story. And we're going to think a little bit about the next sort of section of the biblical story and what we might see there, how we might understand a bit of God's heart for the poor. And I guess one of the things that I'd love us to think about with this series is, in a sense, it's to think about, well, what does it look like to do something that's other or more than just sort of charity or philanthropy? So what's the kind of call, I guess, of God and following God when it comes to thinking about those who are at the margins of society rather than at its center? And if you you know the kind of biblical story, I guess one of the things that you find is that, you know, like last week, in a sense, we looked at the really kind of like fantastic start where there's a story of God creating everything for people to enjoy, and he says it's good, and there's this kind of idea of like shalom, peace, of sufficiency, of plenty, but things quickly unravel, and I guess the kind of unraveling takes place so that you get to a point by Exodus at the beginning of this next book of the Bible where it's not just that a bunch of people think that they actually own the land rather than being stewards of the land, but they think they actually own the people in the land as well. And so there's this moment where everything has gone so horribly wrong as people have kind of grabbed hold of control and have decided that they own things rather than steward things. They kind of push God out of the picture, and they just kind of do life their own way. That what you end up with is the beginning of slavery. And in a sense, in the Exodus story, you also get the beginning of genocide, that things are looking pretty bleak at this point in the story, so soon in some ways after this kind of beautiful beginning that we thought about a couple of weeks ago. And I think what's really striking about this kind of moment is that I think it is about not just a sense of ownership over land, but it's really about ownership over people. That you get this idea emerging that actually, you know, that we talked about a couple of weeks ago about people made in the image of God, the sense of what it means to be made in the image of God and have something of kind of God's character and divine about us, that sense of people made in the image of God have been reduced at this point to just a sort of slave labor economy, people who they hope to wear down with crushing labor. But in the midst of all of that, there's this moment of redemption, to use a kind of like biblical word, I guess, a moment of rescue. And Debs has talked a lot about this verse about a God who sees and hears and acts, because you've got this moment where God hears the cries of these slaves who are suffering as a result of the fact that there's a people group that have decided they own not only the land, but they also own the people in the land. And God hears that, and he comes to put things right. And I think what's really striking about the way that he's going to put things right is he's going to restore people to the land again. So there's a sense here of restoring people back to the kind of Genesis story that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, where human beings live in this kind of good relationship with the land around them and this good relationship with God, and that they live in this land that's good. You know, the creation story's got these like beautiful phrase at the end where it talks about God looking at everything he's made and he declares that it's good. And here is this good and fertile and spacious land that Israel is invited to be a part of. Now, my thought for the week and my the inspiration for today's homework is what comes next in the story as Israel starts to settle in this land and starts to live in this land trying to follow God's call to be stewards rather than owners. And it's really summed up in one word, Zach, or remember. There's this sense in which memory is an incredibly important thing for redeemed people, rescued people to do. And so one of the things that God does as he moves his people out of slavery and in a sense restores their kind of humanness, I guess, their sense of being made in God's image, of not just being owned, but being free agents. And he restores them to land so that they've got the land that they can steward and they can live off, a land of plenty. The thing that he says to them is he says, remember, and that's the thing I'd like us to reflect on a little bit and to try and think about this next week. I'll just give you a couple of examples of where he says that. First of all, in Exodus, there's a couple of times where God says, just remember that you were once slaves in Egypt, you were once foreigners in Egypt. And so as a result of remembering, what I'd like you to do is not to reenact slavery on the foreigners in your land. So just remember that you were once a people owned, and make sure that you don't own others in your land. And then in a really interesting instruction, it's a call not just to the kind of negative. It's not just negatively phrased, kind of don't make slaves, but it's this invitation to love. And I think this is really striking. It's like this invitation to love as a result of remembering. So as you remember that you were slaves yourselves, that you were foreigners, then out of that remembrance comes an invitation to love slaves and foreigners, to love the aliens within your land. Or here, generosity. So an invitation to generosity as a result of memory, of remembering. Remember that you were once slaves in the land of Egypt and the Lord your God redeemed you. And so as a result of that, be generous to those who are your servants who are released. Just don't send them off empty-handed, but them a generous farewell gift. Or give to those who are foreigners. Make sure that you don't rip them off. Provide for them and provide for the widows and the orphans. Always remember you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from slavery. So one of the things that happens, I guess, in the beginning part of the story is that, in a sense, you see the whole thing going kind of horribly wrong, that Egypt thinks that they own the land, they own the people. And in a sense, we see God's rescue work and God's redemption is about putting things right by restoring people to a land, but by then inviting them to live life in that land in a certain kind of way that's rooted in memory, in remembering their time in Egypt. And these phrases are the ones that crop up time and time again in those first few books of the Bible, a call to remember that you yourselves were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. You yourselves were once slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. And the thing I've been thinking about is how that might help us to think a little bit about another kind of binary. You know, the first binary we had, the first call we had was to be stewards, not owners. My sense is that our second call is to be the redeemed, not redeemers. Or if you don't want to use like a kind of biblical language, what about just the rescued, not rescuers? That one of the things that I think is really striking in these early books of the Bible, in Exodus, in Leviticus, in Numbers, in Deuteronomy, is the way that as Israel is starting to live out a new kind of life in the land, that God calls them to remember that they themselves are a people who've been rescued, and that they themselves are a people who've been redeemed, that God has done some kind of dramatic work in pulling them out of slavery and positioning them in the land, and that is like a kind of crucial underlying beginning of the way in which they're going to treat others around them, and in particular treat those who are marginalized, in this case primarily the foreigners, but also widows and orphans, those in a sense who don't have access to the land. So the kind of people that don't have access to the land, the way that they're treated is to be rooted in this understanding of being redeemed, not redeemers, in being rescued, not rescuers. And what I'd like to invite us to is I'd like to invite us to three things. So this is kind of our reflection and homework, and I'll just sort of jot this down and we'll put it out through Facebook as well, is to try and, in a sense, think about what does it mean for me to be rescued and not a rescuer? What does it mean for me to be redeemed and not a redeemer? What does it mean for us as Bristol Vineyard to be a rescued people, a redeemed people? And in particular, how do we play that out when it comes to things like thinking about how we work and with the poor, how we work with those at the margins? First up, one thing I think it does is it's a call to humility. That I think all too often that one of the things that the challenges, I guess, of things like charity and philanthropy is that charity and philanthropy are often rooted not in humility but in pride. That they're often rooted in a sense of kind of, I've got everything and I'm going to give it to you. There's often a kind of rescuer mentality or a sort of almost redeemer mentality about a lot of charity and philanthropy, kind of riding in on a white horse to sort out difficult situations. And I think that the thing that God calls Israel to, and is so central to this first part of the story, is none of that mentality. It's actually to a mentality of being a rescued people rather than of being a rescuer. There's no room here for pride. There's a place, a call to humility. That the relationship that God calls his people to with those around them at the margins is not a relationship of those who've got it all and those who don't, but it's a relationship of those who are quite conscious of the fact that they don't have it all, that they haven't always had it all, that there are people who've been rescued, are being rescued, and that is how they operate and stand from. So first thing, call to humility, and I'll think a bit about how we could reflect on that over the week. Second thing, I think, call to identify, and I think this is really powerful in this story. And again, I think this is one of the things about often charity and philanthropy, is that charity and philanthropy is often very much about a kind of other. It's kind of like, well, here I am, and I've got all this stuff, and you have nothing, and I will give you my stuff. Whereas actually, the thing that's really striking, I think, in this biblical story is that God's called his people to identify with those who are in need of rescue, because they themselves are a people in need of rescue. They're called to identify with the foreigners and the enslaved, because they themselves were a people who were foreigners and enslaved. They're called to identify with the marginalized, because they themselves were people at the margins. They themselves were a people excluded, and therefore they're called to identify with those who are excluded. Those who are redeemed, those who are rescued, are called to identify with those in need of redemption and those in need of rescue. And this, I think, is a really powerful statement that God invites his people to identify with those who are poor, marginalized, excluded, those who are other, those who are alien, because they themselves know that actually that's their own status as well, that they know that they're a rescued people rather than rescuers, that they're a redeemed people rather than redeemed. And I'll also send out some homework later on this week, which will be a kind of practical way of thinking a bit about how to do that. Final thing, I think this is a call to intercession. It's a call to cry out to the Redeemer, to the Rescuer. One of the kind of things, I guess, again, where this is so different from charity and philanthropy is that charity and philanthropy, in a sense, can operate in a world where I've got kind of sufficient to meet the needs of anyone who's in need, and I kind of from my kind of generosity and benevolence I kind of give out. I think what God is calling his people to in these passages is very much to be a rescued people and a redeemed people who call upon the Redeemer and the Rescuer to keep acting, to keep redeeming, to keep rescuing, and to bring others into that fold, to invite others to experience for themselves that redemption and that rescue. I think that's one of the things that's really striking about the story as it develops, is that those foreigners in Israel's midst in this period, they're not just people who are going to share in the land and share in the goodness of the land, to kind of have the plenty and sufficiency of a God who owns this land, but they're also increasingly called in to share in God as well, to be a part of God's story, to be included in God's story, to experience what it's like to be a redeemed and rescued person. And I think that's one of the things that I'd kind of call us to as BV, is as we think about what it looks like to reflect on God's heart for the poor. As we think about being not just stewards but owners, but also rescued and not rescuers, that one of the things I think God calls us to is to call upon Him on behalf of those who are at the margins and those who are excluded, and to pray for them, to intercede for them, to take them before this rescuer God, and ask this rescuer God to rescue them in the way that He's rescuing us, has rescued and is rescuing us. That there's often, I think, in kind of church, the history of the church, there's often been a kind of divide between the sort of like the spiritual stuff of like prayer and worship, and the kind of like social action stuff of like soup kitchens and food banks. And in a sense, I think understanding that we're rescued, not rescuers, means bringing the two together. It means recognizing that as we do food banks and soup kitchens, that we don't do it with a kind of rescuer mentality, assuming that we're people who can change the world in our own strength, but we do it as rescued people who call upon the rescuer to expand his rescue work. And the thing I'd almost encourage you to do this week, and I'll jot a few things down about this, pop them in the chat, and then I'll send them out, is who are you called at the moment to identify with? So there's lots of people in need in our city, in our nation, in our world. Who are you called to identify with? And what does it look like for you to not just identify with them, but also to take them before God and to intercede on their behalf, and to call upon the rescuer and to ask him to rescue them as well. So I'll scribble some homework in the chat, and then I'll send it out through Facebook as well. But last time we were thinking, what does it mean from the creation story to be stewards rather than owners? What I'd like us to now add to that is to think about a little bit over the next few weeks. What does it mean when we think about God's heart for the poor? What does it mean for us to understand ourselves as rescued, a rescued people? That BV is characterized by being a bunch of people who know what it's like to have been rescued. And what does that mean as we think about how we interact with those also in need of rescuing?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Tim. Another talk to explode our brains a little bit. So thank you very much. That was brilliant. I think, I think there's just so much to unpack there, and so much to pray about, and ask God to just show us the things that we can be doing to be rescued people. One of the words that came in before the service was lift your eyes, even just for a moment. I know your deepest fears and sorrows, and I've been with you all along. And just that reminder that we can lift our eyes and look to Jesus. So as Catherine leads us in worship now, let's lift our eyes up to Jesus and thank him for rescuing us.